breaths, settles himself from the passing discomfort. From the carriage window sees a small railway station, and an oversized sign that stated, Sapri. He was a third of the way to Rome. A small town of barely 4,000 souls on a good day. And like many coastal towns these days, a popular tourist destination. The cove lined with moored fishing boats, and their nets hanging in the mid-afternoon sun to dry. Idyllic, he thought. Then noticed someone sitting opposite, staring directly at him. And he was also clergy. Of a kind. Divine, isn't it? Are you all right? Enquired Michael, seeing the sudden stop had shaken Francis. Picking up the book, handed it back to him. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Thoughts of a dream surface, but like all dreams is soon forgotten. There was a vague memory of something nice. Like freshly baked bread. He thought. The familiar scent lingers in his nostrils. Allow me introduce myself. I'm Father Michael. Extending his hand. I'm Father Francis. Extending his. Their grips were identical. Though Michael's grip was firm, his hands were soft and smooth. No roughness one would come to expect from a man who labored gardens and helped the poor. It was warm grip. And he felt a comfort suddenly come over him. It reminded him of his dream. What brings you to travel today, Father? Enquired Francis. I'm heading the Vatican. I haven't been there for so many years, replied Michael. He barely looked in his late 20s, thought Francis. Michael's complexion was flawless. Untouched by the harsh Italian sun that stains the most hardened of parishioners' hides. I'm heading to the Vatican as well. I have been summoned by Cardinal Cassini. Hoping to qualify the importance of the invitation. Ah. Cardinal Cassini. I know him well. I know him very well. Answered Michael with a quiet reservation in his voice. You do? Asked Francis. I know nothing of him. I tried to search him on the net, but there was nothing about him. Francis sounded with some confusion. No. I wouldn't think one would find the Cardinal, started Michael. They like to keep him off the radar, so to speak. Pausing before considering next statement. Francis leaned forward. It would be best not to get too acquainted with the Cardinal. Do not be surprised by his methods. Show him great respect and you might, pausing to consider his choice of words, return home with the great honor of having served the Church. Michael concluded, holding back the explicit details. Thank you for your words of advice. Cardinal Cassini was obviously a very important person, thought Francis. Indeed, responded Michael, overhearing the thought. After dispatching its human cargo, a whistle blew. An old man wearing a frayed railway uniform, both of which predated the last war, waved an old red paddle to signify the train's imminent departure. Lurched abruptly again, lurching Francis with it. Michael looked at Francis and smiled. It was a smile that was communicable, radiant, as though he belonged to a special congress of people doing God's work. Looking out the carriage window, Francis' eyes followed. The small town with its oversized sign, and 4,000 souls moved slowly past, falling behind with each rotation of the wheels. As though suspended by the hand of God, the afternoon sun shone through the window. The old train continued its slow waltz north, continuing along the seaside tracks, through long dark tunnels and rocking Francis in his cradle, and back to sleep to resume his dream. His mind reconnecting to a dream world and the smell of freshly baked bread. Suddenly the train lurched forward. Not again, he thought, annoyed by the intrusion. The aroma of freshly baked bread remained and drifted into his nostrils. Taking in the seductive aroma. I must have dozed off again. Looking out the window to see a small seaside town. A population 4,000 souls on a good day. A cove lined with moored fishing boats with their nets hanging to dry. Tourists taking photographs. And an oversized sign that stated, Sapri. Francis looked opposite to where Michael had been sitting. No longer there. He looks about the compartment and to the platform outside. Seeing the same old man wearing the same old uniform. Predating the same old war. Waving the same old red paddle. Blowing the same old whistle to dispatch the same human cargo. The paperback still on his lap. Still open at the page he had last read. It had not fallen to the floor, as it had before. Between the open pages lay a small elegant white feather. Puzzled by its appearance. Closing the paperback with the feathers still inside. It must have been a dream. He thought, trying to recall it. What was the conversation he had with? Who was it? Father Michael? What had he said? Not to get too acquainted with the Cardinal? Reaching to his shoulder, as if to recapture the pain? Nothing? Maybe he had imagined that too. Opening the paperback to continue reading. The feather now lodged with a red ticket bookmark. Now appearing to have a neat hole punched in the corner. He could not recall having had it punched. Had he been sitting in the sun too long? Repositioning to the shady side of the carriage, and made himself comfortable. The afternoon sun sank lower towards the horizon. Its rays creeped deeper into the compartment, reaching for him. Michael sat quietly watching on. Enjoying the divine sunlight soaking into his eternal soul. Roma. The train rolled its way north. Through the ancient Italian townships of Pisciata and San Marco. A further stretch would take him past a beach front lined with colorful multi-layered buildings. Then a short hop to the Pompeii with its grisly Roman burial grounds. Mount Vesuvius slept, its bloody horn capped with snow. Twitching now and again, troubled by a disturbing dream of 1,000 years ago. 30 kilometers north lay Naples. The central hub of Italy, and the halfway point of Francis' journey to Vatican City. There he would encounter a small delay, before connecting a train to Rome. And chance for him to stretch his legs. He had not been that far north for years. There was no necessity. Amanti satisfied all his earthly needs. Places were all much the same to he had reasoned. Simply labeled with different names. 3 p.m. and the old train shunted into the Naples station. Awakening Francis from a dream. There was no smell of freshly baked bread. And the dream faded as sight of the station overwhelmed his senses. The train talked back to itself as it came to a jerking halt. Sighing steam over the platform. Relieved it had delivered Francis this far. Gathering his bag, he makes his way along the arcade of stores that terraced the walls. Finding a cafe that looked quiet, joined the queue of patrons waiting to be served. Before finding himself a table with a view of the platform and the large departure board, he settled in and made himself comfortable. It would be another 20 minutes before his next train left for Rome. Plenty of time to enjoy a bite, and marveled at engineering feat of the Napoli Central Railway Station's architecture. A roof of stained glass windows replicating a giant cathedral, flooded by natural sunlight that filtered upon the steady stream of commuters below. In a life before becoming a priest, he had dreamed of being an architect. Torn with a passion to serve the church, conceded the world had enough architects, and his faith in God was stronger. Forsaking his dream, chose the path less taken, and became a priest. Rewarded with 12 years in Brescia before being transferred to Amanti. All that seemed a lifetime ago. He was being paroled, after time served with good behavior. Believing he could serve the remainder of his sentence out under the watchful eye of the Cardinal Cassini. Feeling he had been chosen. In some ways he had. But not by the Cardinal. Pondering the encounter he had had with Father Michael. If he had at all. Recalling snippets of their conversation. Taking the book from a pocket, opened it and stared at the white feather between its pages. Unsure what to make of it. Their meeting seemed so real. Yet he had found himself reliving the arrival to Sapri. God works in mysterious ways, surmises Francis. Recalling Michael's soft hands, his firm grip. As with most things that defy belief, Francis put his faith in God, and accepted he had met Father Michael. Whoever, or whatever he was. A whistle blew loudly for all to hear, as though to pull him away from the doubting thoughts. All aboard. A voice cried out, before blowing the whistle louder and longer than before. It was time to board the train to Rome. This would not be on the old train Francis had travelled from Amanti. This was streamlined high-speed luxury. Or so the brochure had read. The locomotive appeared more like a rocket on wheels. Assuming it had wheels. A silver metal beast with a pointed nose, and 5 nostrils that breathed beams of light. A single large central rectangular eye in its elongated forehead. Marked with an orange-red streak along its metallic skinned back. On the platform opposite stood the train on which he had arrived. He compared the two. It was like comparing chalk with a cheese. Both serving their passengers well. Taking them from A to B, one in comfort, the other in style. A conductor blew his whistle, and waved a red paddle about. His uniform did not belong to any prior war that Francis recognized. Italian trains ran precisely on time. English stragglers would be left behind, cursing the efficiency of European timetables. Stepping inside the belly of the metallic beast, was swallowed by its narrow intestines to his allotted seat. Snug seats. Unlike the thinly padded wooden benches of the first train, the seat captured him and held him in place. The modern train moved from the station. Francis watched as the station's platform glided past the window outside, accelerating smoothly from the giant cathedral. Sunlight desperately tried to penetrate the tinted window, but in vain. Of the photons that succeeded, only a few could lock onto him. With an hour and a half hours to Rome, Francis opened his paperback, The Fires of Spring. A romantic adventure of a young man traveling across America in the Depression days. By train. In many ways he identified with the adventurous young man. The train would arrive precisely in Rome at 6 p.m. Arrival times, much like their counterpart, were always precise. Taking the coastal route, the train sped north, slipping unseen through Monte San Vigio. Renowned for dishes of shrimp and wild asparagus, of pork sausages, of chili pepper and coriander seed. These would pass unsavored by Francis' palate, before deviating inland and aiming itself north to Rome, or Roma, as the Italians referred to it. Nestled on the shores of the Tiber River, it was the home to some 4 million souls. Roma derived its name from the ancient word Ruma, or Tit, referring to 2 of the 7 hills of Rome, the Palatine and Aventine hills, and a fabled wolf that had adopted and suckled the fabled twins Romulus and Remus. Then again, it could easily have also referred to the city's founder and first king, Romulus. And from humble villages grew the mighty Roman Empire. In time it would crumble under their own weight. And behind it ancient ruins of forums and colosseums, provoking thoughts of gladiators fighting, of Christians being fed to the lions. The Vatican sat on its own hill, as if being estranged from the other 7 hills of Rome. While Roman Empire succumbed to political erosion, the Vatican was still in its manger, an infant, its voice yet to be heard. 1700 years later, now the world's oldest institution. And it was this ancient institution that Francis had come to visit. A corporate head office, the Holy See, the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Catholic Church, headed by the commander-in-chief, his namesake, Pope Francis. Arriving at the Roma terminal was an emotional experience for Francis. Just 4 kilometers to the west lay the Vatican City. The chair released him from its grip, and he stretched in unison with the other passengers getting to their feet. Darkest was descending outside. The sun had been defeated and would allow him to walk free. Tomorrow it would try again. He had traveled almost the length of Italy, some 500 kilometers, covering more distance in 5 hours than an ancient Roman legions would in a week on foot, heading to the rest rooms to make himself more presentable, wanting to look like an ordained priest. Those that had seen the civilian man entering the restroom would not have recognized the ordained man that existed it, as though lead had become gold, making his way through the incoming wave of commuters. He had 2 choices. Take the metro and 5-minute walk to the Vatican City, or a taxi that would take him directly there. The last thing he wanted was another train ride. Electing the taxi, headed to the rank outside, wanting to be dropped as close as he could to the Vatican gates. Queues of white taxis waited to devour the never-ending supply of foreign souls. Climbing into one, closed the door. The noise of the station fell silent. The interior smelt of cigarettes, and opened a window to allow fresh air and sounds to circulate. "Where to, Father?" asked the driver. "Vatican, please," he replied, proud as punch. "Yes, Father." The driver responded reverently, pulling out into the congested traffic. There is a madness to Roma traffic. Those that drove it daily knew its pulse. It was like the mind of a woman, wild and unpredictable. The driver cursed at the other drivers, then sought absolution from Francis, who was not listening. in a trance, stared out the window into the growing darkness and the chaos on wheels unconcerned. Thank God he was not driving, he thought to himself. Where you from, father? The driver inquired, detecting his Italian accent. Amanti. You've come a long way, father. The driver could not take the father the long way, as he would the foreign tourists. And so charge more. Perhaps double on a good day. His place in heaven would be assured if he took him directly to his destination. Without delay. Without transgression. And without sin. Driving in Roma traffic was like swimming in a crowded pool of colorful metal fish. Minnows, scooters that darted between the other metal fish. Sharks, taxers on the lookout for unsuspecting foreign prey. Double-decker whales, pushing their way through the smaller metal fishes that moved out of the way in fear of being swallowed whole. A gigantic synchronized eddy washed around the large roundabout, pizza. Twirling layers intertwined, then dispersed in dyslexic directions. Appearing as chaotic madness was in fact a glorious waltz. Engines provided a musical accompaniment. Scooters the soprano. Cars the tenor. Buses the bass. And tooting, the horn section. Utter madness, Francis thought. It had a rhythm. A holistic heartbeat that said it was alive. It was Roma. He felt safe in the belly of the shark that was taking him home. Michael sat unseen quietly beside him in the back seat, marveling at the divine chaos outside. He was going home too. Vatican City. A taxi pulls up outside large black iron-barred gates. One of two main entrances to the Vatican City. Two brightly colored Swiss guards stood rigid. Vivid blue, red and orange striped uniforms glowed almost fluorescently in the dying light. Looking ominous, their tall menacing spiked halberds hooked for grappling mounted combatants. There would be no mounted assailants today. Just endless foreign tourists with digital cameras. Swiss guards have served as protectors at foreign courts since the 15th century. By the mid-19th century the Swiss constitution had outlawed their service. With exception of the pontifical regiment. Bodyguards to the Pope and de facto military of the Vatican. The gates would soon be locked for the evening, leaving the public stranded outside until normal shopping hours resumed the next day. Inside the gates, however, the Vatican machinery operated 24/7. As it did in heaven, so would it on earth. Through the large arches of the gate Francis could see the familiar structures. At the center of St. Peter's Square stood the ancient Egyptian obelisk. About the stony pointed monument stood another. The Basilica. A Renaissance church within the Vatican City. An enclave and residence of the Pope. Within, a trove of iconic art, sculptures. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. And Cardinal Cassini. Francis stared at the smallest country in the world, taking up less than half of a square kilometer, cocooning a population of 850. Tens of thousands of daily visitors. And tenfold as many pigeons. Tourists still lingered about the entrance hoping for a chance glimpse of the Pope. The Vatican itself is not open to tourists. Only the ordained and invited dignitaries were privileged to access it. Tentatively approaching the imposing Swiss guards, he introduced himself, handing them the letter and envelope from the Cardinal. Recognizing the blood-red wax seal Francis had broken. They looked at him with intrigue and interest, but not suspicion. "We've been expecting you," one guard quietly advised, and directed him to step inside the archway. Keys clatter against metal, and a resounding clunk as the lock latches as the large gates close behind him. He is escorted across the immense square. One guard lead, the other followed, cutting a solitary figure between the two tall guards. Feeling and looking like prisoner being taken to his place of execution. Guards in their colorful historic uniforms. Him in historic black clergy robes. Marching awkwardly out of step. Unable to match the towering guard's lengthy strides. Skipping at times to keep up. Occasionally looking up to the large marble statues of saints that rimmed the basilica roof top that were looking down on him. Watching him. Assessing him. Scrutinizing him. "Is this him?" one saint asks another. "Aye," replies the other. "He's the last one." Unsure what to make of Francis. "Aye," confirms the saint. "Doesn't look like much." They never do. They never do. Taking in the divine iniquity. Feeling not worthy to look at them, Francis lowers his head and uttered a silent prayer. His suitcase swaying in time with the orderly march. The basilica loomed closer and larger with every step. The evening sky providing a cosmic backdrop to the celestial building. Conceived by Michelangelo, the basilica is regarded as the holiest of Catholic shrines. Tradition holds that it is the burial site of Saint Peter, the first bishop of Rome. It is said, his tomb supposedly lays directly below the high altar. Hundreds of thousands of Christians make the pilgrimage to the holy city of faith. At this exact moment in time, it was the pilgrimage of one chosen person. Francis of Amanti. Guards lead him up the long stone steps. Hallowed ground reserved for a select few. Huge magnificent doors opened for before him, and he enters a glorious hall. Above him, a ceiling befitting a cathedral. Suspending a magnificent crystal chandelier. Appearing as a gigantic star-lit orb. The opulence would have Christ turn in his tomb. He is instructed to take a seat and wait. The Cardinal would be out to see him shortly. "Oh," said Francis, feeling insignificant in the immense hall. Taking a seat on an armchair gilded with rich red and gold upholstery. He had sat on many seats today, but this was the most lavish. Everything in the Vatican appeared lavish. Over the millennia the Vatican had acquired immense power. And with it immense wealth. The incongruence of empty stomachs of the poor caused a chill to run over him. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was a draught. Sitting quietly, takes in the great hall in which he found himself. Pairs of clergy could be seen wandering around talking inaudibly to each other. As if they had learned to confine their voices to their immediate proximity. A majestic stairway curved to a second floor much higher up. He wondered who, or what was up there. Large paintings of popes' walls adorned the walls. Each in their ancient holy regalia. Some wore the triple tiara, with 3 crowns. Others the decorative mitre. Modern popes bore the papal ferula topped by a crucifix. While others, a shepherd's crook crozier. Each wore the fisherman's ring. A relief of Saint Peter casting his net from a boat. Each would have their names engraved around the relief. Each would be destroyed with a hammer when they died, symbolically signifying end to the Pope's authority. Again he found himself surrounded by superior eyes looking down at him. Lowering his head, he prayed. Satisfied he had humbled himself before his peers. Quietly recalled the day's journey and encounters. Reaching for his book. Then remembered where he was. And takes out the Bible his mother had given it to him upon his entry to the seminary. Reading in silence for a period of time. Then he heard voices. Looking in the direction of where the voices was coming from, and saw a cardinal speaking to someone who appeared to be the Pope. Immediately he stood to attention. He would wait patiently should the cardinal to walk his way. The Bishop of Rome looks briefly towards his namesake. Returned his attention to the cardinal, spoke a few words before walking away. Seeing Francis standing alone, the cardinal walks unhurriedly towards him, extending a hand to introduce himself. Father Francis. I am Cardinal Cassini, he said in a voice that came with age and position. How was your trip? Sire, Your Eminence, the trip was good. Thank you. Francis replied nervously. Let me show you to your room. You will need your rest after a tiring day. I will have arranged for a meal to be brought to your room, instructed Cassini. Thank you, Your Eminence. Cardinal will suffice, Father. I am not one for glorifications. We will discuss more tomorrow before we leave for London. If you would like to come with me, I will show you your room. The cardinal gestured Francis to follow him. Along hallways and stairways of the scared labyrinth of the Vatican. Thinking he would never find his way back. Barely had he landed in Rome, and tomorrow would be heading to London. Wondering now if he had packed enough warm clothes. I see you pack light, added the cardinal, as if reading his thoughts. That's good. We will be doing a bit of traveling. Arriving at a set of large double doors, gilded with gold. Ah. Here we are. A meal will arrive shortly. There is a telephone should you require anything. Simply lift the receiver and speak. I will return tomorrow morning at 8:00 am. Be ready to leave. Tomorrow we have long day ahead of us. Then Cardinal added, I wish we had more time. But should we return, I would be happy to give you a personal tour of the Vatican. Thank you very much, Your Cardinal. You're most kind. Francis graciously accepted. With those final instructions, the Cardinal opened the double doors, and revealed another glorious room. Unsure if the Cardinal had the correct room. Thank you, Cardinal. He responds, taken back by the grandeur. Closing the doors behind him. Places the small leather suitcase down. Looking out of place in the oversized room. Adorned with carved angels. A ceiling of painted cherubs on puffy white clouds above. A far cry from his humble parish dormitory of clay walls. A simple wooden cross on the wall. What am I doing here? He asked himself, feeling like a fish out of water. His mind flooded with unanswered questions. What was in London? What did the Cardinal mean by should we return? Michael stood beside Francis, and quietly took in the opulent room. Perhaps he would have a word with his superior. This page is blank or it has intensive graphic content. London. Time was of the essence if the Cardinal wanted to catch the sun. The Eurostar was fast, but it could not match the speed and comfort of the Vatican private jet. At 30,000 feet, Cassini and Francis had taken the more direct route to London. The Cardinal was familiar with its streets and dreary weather, having visited the city on church business numerous times, finding it the most bewildering of cities. One either loved the place or hated it, possibly simultaneously, often wondering how the Church had lost this Anglo-Saxon archdiocese so many centuries before, but accepted they had made better Protestants than they did Catholics. Arriving at the 4-star Mayfair Millennium Hotel in the heart of the city, the hotel afforded him the Cardinal a privacy from public view, a dwelling place for those wishing to go unnoticed. The doorman, complete with a bowler hat, greeted regular guests, but never by name, acknowledging their return with a small nod. Francis stood staring at the magnificent building like a bewildered tourist, familiar with Roman-Italian architecture that belonged to no particular period. This was a very different kind of architecture, Georgian Victorian. The latent architect in him looked up at the grand facade. Its columns reminded him of the classical architecture of Greece. The English had stolen it and made it their own, much as they had done with his religion. "Hurry up, Father, please. Try to keep up," Cassini insisted. "Sorry, Cardinal." Francis shuffled forward. Through large gilded glass revolving doors he entered a luxurious foyer that was as spectacular as the facade. Fit for a pope, Francis thought. "What am I doing here?" The concierge had been expecting them. Words were rarely spoken at the Mayfair. Guests preferred it that way. A well-groomed bellboy wearing a plum-red uniform carried their bags to their room. A magnetic key opened the door, and they enter an elegant room of tall ceilings and long-laced draped windows. A sparkling crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling and illuminated the room. The Cardinal excused him to make further arrangements regarding a vehicle and would return shortly for dinner, informing Francis that he should make himself at home, advising there was a minibar should he prefer something stronger than English tea. Francis did exactly that, and made himself at home, or as closely as he could. It was a far cry from his humble parish. The English tea would have been a luxury. It was highly improbable that he would ever see the inside of such a beautiful residence again, second only to that of the room at the Vatican. Opening the minibar spies a small bottle whiskey, liking a wee drop once in a while. Scottish whiskies were rare in southern Italy. Removing the cap, the aroma of fruit flavors, distinct spices, and honey notes filled his nostrils. Not that he could tell one from the other. Taking several cubes of ice, placed them deftly into the crystal tumbler, pouring the golden spirit over the frozen crystals, and eased his traveled-weary body into a large leather armchair. He made himself comfortable, turning on the large flat-screen television. Flips through the numerous channels before settling on a program all television stations had in common. The news, wars and storms, death and tragedy, filled the headlines. In the seminary he had been taught of God's will, but he wondered how much of what he was seeing was of man's will. What they had not been taught him was that tragedy sells advertising, and that it was good for business. Francis continued to watch. It was a glimpse of the outside world, a world which for him started and ended at his parish in Amante. The Cardinal returned to the room and discovers Francis watching television, a crystal tumbler in his hand. Cassini pours himself a whiskey, one of the few indulges he had. Pouring it neat, takes a seat beside Francis, content for the time being to resurrect his soul after the lengthy journey. "You managed to arrange the vehicle?" Francis enquired, breaking the silence. "It's all been arranged. They are very good here," Cassini replied. Maybe the whiskey had softened his tempered inhibitions. "We'll discuss more of why we are here after dinner. I have arranged for meals to come to our room. You may select something from menu if you like," indicating the black leather folder on the glass coffee table. "I'll be having my usual," he added, not identifying what the usual was. Taking a sip from his glass, Francis savors the strong essences before swallowing whole. Picking up the menu, opens it and examines the half a dozen meals, narrowing his selection down to a very English dish: roast beef, roast potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, with gravy and greens, which included Brussels sprouts. He had heard much about roast beef and Yorkshire pudding from the English tourists, and was keen to savor the English delicacy. The meals arrived, and the Cardinal gave grace before they began. Both ate in silence, holding communion with themselves and their meals. The Cardinal enjoying a fettuccine Alfredo, tossed with Parmesan cheese and butter. Melted cheese emulsified with the liquids, coating the pasta in a smooth and rich sauce. It had been one of his favorite dishes since he was a boy, when his parents would take him to a restaurant that belonged to the great Italian chef Alfredo di Lelio, after which the dish was named. To savor it brought back many childhood memories. It was heavenly in more than the culinary sense. Francis, on the other hand, was being tantalized by the Yorkshire pudding. Quite peculiar, he thought. With surgical precision he separated the variety of items on the plate, as if undertaking a culinary autopsy. The beef tender with gravy only adding to the gastronomic pleasure. He was unsure what to make of the Brussels sprouts with their unusual texture and taste, taming them with a little added butter and salt. Sharing a bottle of dark red wine, Francis found it exquisite and enquired where it was from. "New Zealand. The Marlborough region, I believe," responded the Cardinal, lifting the bottle and checking the label. His knowledge in wine was as extensive as it was with whiskey. Unable to place the country geographically, Francis knew the luxury would not last, savored every last morsel and every last drop. Befriending the Cardinal was not so bad, he thought. Not to get too close. He recalls Michael's warning. The dream still lingering long after the train ride. Like a haunting memory, Father Michael seemed such an angelic ghost. He eyes the Cardinal suspiciously as to a darker side, appearing self-assured, confident, wise and old, as one would expect an elderly statesman to be. Unable to detect any sign of danger about the man, dismisses Michael's warning. Feeling very full and very satisfied, the Cardinal discussed their mission in London and beyond if need be. This came as a surprise to the Francis, who thought their business would simply be confined to London. The Cardinal advised him of his intentions to follow the son of the man who held the fisherman's ring. Follow the son, find the father, and find the ring. He informed Francis, listening on intently, keeping the dangers from him. The less he knew, the safer he would be, advising how tomorrow he would take the hire car and watch the sun's movements. The Cardinal would teach the inexperienced father the art of being stealth, molding him gently like clay. There was no rush. Nothing happened very fast at the Vatican. Cassini dismissed Francis to make ready for bed, and finished his glass of fine red wine. Saving the textures of the fruit and spices, his mind began to drift. The fettuccine Alfredo had reminded him of his childhood in Rome. On this rare occasion he began to reminisce of his long journey to where he found himself today. Born Antonio Mario Cassini 10 years after the last World War, in the small Italian northwest town of Porticomero. The eldest of 5 children. His father was an Irish immigrant engineer. His mother was an immigrant from Buenos Aires. A traffic accident that took the lives of his other siblings, save his sister Maria, that survived. By fate or divine intervention, he was not in the car that day. Their deaths, and possibly his, had weighed on his mind heavily ever since. Attending a technical school, Antonio graduated with a diploma in chemistry, working a few years as a laboratory technician, holding down a variety of odd jobs that included, of all things, a bouncer. At the age of 21, suffers a life-threatening pneumonia, having to part of a lung removed. As he lay in the hospital bed, he experienced what some would describe as a near-death experience. He found himself floating, looking down upon himself, feeling unafraid. A pure white light appeared and drew him closer. He knew, without knowing why, that he had to make a choice between staying and leaving his earthly corporal body, despite the pain that his decaying mortal human body was suffering. There was a destiny that needed to be fulfilled. In the moment between heartbeats, where death resides, found himself back in his body. Life again filled his senses. Pain filled his chest. Antonio knew he had touched the hand of God. As soon as he was well enough, resigned his jobs and joined the seminary to serve God. Pope John Paul would ordain him, and so began his internship as cardinal under one of the greatest pontiffs that ever lived. If he had touched the hand of God, Antonio had also touched the hand of a saint. But that was a long time ago, and he had come a long way since then. Was it all just a dream? He would ask himself when doubt crept into his mind. He wondered about the white light. What if he had decided to go? Just as he had been pulled back to his crippled body, he knew instinctively he had made the right choice. Not that he had made the decision. Perhaps one had been made for him. His consciousness drifted back to the room, and they became one again. Orientating himself, focused on the purpose for why he was there. Inhaling deeply, air reached the extremities of 1½ lungs. Finishing the last of his wine, stood and readied himself for bed. Tomorrow he would begin the surveillance of the Englishman's son. Wondering where it would lead him. Follow the sun. Find the father. And find the ring. He repeats to himself. The holy ring of Saint Peter himself. The gun. The Eurostar speed swiftly through the Kent countryside. Colors rushed past the window. The grey of the city turned to the green and rustic browns of pastures and forests. heading towards Folkestone, the British portal town of the Channel. There it would take another 20 minutes to reach the French portal town of Coquelles. Arthur knew as much about Coquelles as he did about Folkestone. Places have history to them, much unspoken, much forgotten. Folkestone laid in a valley between two cliffs. A millennia and a half earlier, Saint Augustine had passed through, bringing Christianity to the pagan land. Arthur stared out the window and saw a sleepy fishing port passing by. The pagans had long since disappeared. Nothing much happened here, he thought, letting the town and its history slip from view. Sensing a reduction in speed as the train slid into the open mouth of the megastructure, the idyllic vista changed from quaint white cottages to sterile grey concrete walls. Descending to a depth of 115 meters beneath the English Channel. Above them, shipwrecks of the Spanish Armada had been sunk on their disastrous journey to conquer England 400 years earlier. Like a sudden lunar eclipse, darkness filled the exterior cavity. Lights flashed by at regular intervals, hypnotizing him as he sat transfixed, eyes unable to focus. His mind drifted in and out of the darkness. "Let's see it then?" asked Phil, startling him, who had been on his laptop since leaving London. "You get reception down here?" Arthur asked curiously. "Of course. Everything is Wi-Fi these days." "I knew that. I just didn't think you'd get it 100 meters below sea level," exclaimed Arthur. "Let's see it then?" he asked again like a broken record. "See what?" "The GUN." Spelling out the forbidden word. His aunt had used to spell in front of him sometimes when speaking to his father when he was a child. Less so these days. This time he managed to decipher the word. "What for?" "I just want to see it. I did some territorial training before I entered university," informed Phil proudly. "I didn't know that. Maybe it was a good you did come along." "Come on then," pleaded Phil, keen to see it. "Okay. But not here. Take the bag to the restroom. And don't let anyone see you. I want a full report when you get back," ordered Arthur. "Yes, sir," responded Phil sharply. "Phil, keep an eye out for anyone suspicious. You don't know who is following us." Watching Phil walk down the aisle towards the restroom, looking about the cabin again. Everyone were behaving normally. The only person not behaving normally was him. Eyes shifted to the window into the darkness and the lights flashing by. His mind in thought as to what lay ahead. The answers he searched for were in Budapest. And Budapest was still a continent away. Phil located the restrooms, and latched the door behind him. And stares at himself in the wall mirror. Staring back at him. On the surface he appeared calm. Underneath he was anxious. Why had he decided to come along? This was something Arthur could not do alone. Something told him he had to be there. They were complete opposites. A pair of unlikely lads. Yet they complemented each other. Arthur would do the same for me, he thought. Taking a deep breath, opened the duffel bag. And peered in. The cubicle's overhead light shone on the contents. "Oh shit," he said to himself. Unsure if it was the gun. or the amount of cash that surprised him most. Maybe Arthur's dad really had robbed a bank. Reaching into the bag, pulled out the gun, and immediately recognized its rudimentary boxish features. A Glock. Having seen them advertised for sale, and hopefully to people with handgun licenses. Looking for find the safety catch. It did not appear to have one. Was it loaded? Pressing a latch at the base of the handle, the magazine popped, then slid out. Anyone watching him would have thought he had handled the gun before. And they would be wrong. Though the gun was growing on him, his training had given him a basic understanding of the weapon. The Glock was new to him. Examining the magazine, it was loaded. He would Google more about gun when he got back to his seat. Quick thinking said there might be a bullet in the chamber. Sliding the magazine back into the handle, gave the base a stroke with his palm. Clicking back into position. One hand gripping the handle, the other slowly pulled the top backwards to reveal nothing in the chamber. That's a good sign. Relieved it could go off accidentally. Satisfied with the gun. Places it on the metal bench, and checks the cash in the bag. Opening the bag further, discovers several rolls bank notes. Euros and pounds. Arthur was not joking about several round trips. He knew who was buying the beers on this journey. Placing the gun back in the bag, and pulled the cord tight. His heart racing. Thinking he should be at home about now, surfing the net with a cup of tea. And not staring at himself in a mirror on a train, with a gun and bag full of money. Heading to Budapest on the basis of a letter from Arthur's father. Thoughts of having to go through checkpoints in France and Belgium. The last thing he wanted to be caught with a gun and load of money. Then be incarcerated in a French jail. He had an idea. Looking about the restroom, he spies a ceiling panel. Taking out a roll of euros from the bag, pockets it. Secures the bag again and climbs onto the bench. Pushing the ceiling panel upwards to reveal a small dark ceiling cavity. Large enough to conceal the duffel bag. Hoping it would go undetected until it was time to disembark the train. Carefully he shoves the bag into a darkened corner. Closing the ceiling panel to its original position, he climbed down. Feeling pleased with his cunning plan, and relieved to have unburdened themselves of the incriminating bag. Splashing cold water on his face. And stares at his reflection in the mirror, staring back at him. Think, Phil, think. He said to himself. Clean up the area. Can't have dust or footprints over the bench to arouse suspicions, and have people only to look up at the panel. Instinctive thoughts sparked between neurons. Thoroughly wiping down the bench, satisfied it was as it was before he had entered. And regathered his composure. Unlatching the door, he was startled by an old man waiting outside. Sorry. Phil apologized. Eyes met. Locked momentarily. Then disengaged. Brief smiles exchanged. That's all right, young man, replied the old man. Phil looked back to the closed restroom door. Suspicious of the sudden encounter. Hoping he had done enough to cover his tracks. And made his way back to his seat only to find Arthur had disappeared. Looking up and down the aisle. To see no sign of him. He must be still on the train. He couldn't have gotten off. He reasoned. Taking his seat again. All he could do was wait. This was probably a good time to check out the Glock on the net. A listing appeared and he clicks on the wiki link, made from an advanced synthetic polymer. Blah blah blah. Semi-automatic with a short recoil. Austrian made. No safety catch. That explained why he could not find one. File note, keep the finger away from the trigger. Blah blah blah. The number of rounds varied with each model. Blah blah blah. Effective firing range 50 meters. Good to know. 5 million built. Not good to know. Blah blah blah. Preferred weapon of choice among the US military and FBI. Blah blah blah. Polymer construction meant that it could circumvent metal detectors. Reading the specifications aloud in his mind. What you up to? Surfing dating sites again? Asked Arthur's surprising Phil mid-thoughts. Returning with 2 cups of coffee and sandwiches. I like your thinking, mate. But alas no. Just doing some homework on that gun. Responded Phil, quite pleased with himself. Then Arthur noticed something was missing. Where's the bag? He asked anxiously. Don't worry. I've hidden it a ceiling cavity until we get clear of Brussels. Here, I took out some cash. Handing Arthur the wad of euros he had taken from the bag. Too many checkpoints for my liking. Phil conceded. Good thinking. Let's hope no one looks up there. I was a little worried myself how we would get through the border checks. What did you find out? Arthur asked curiously. Phil gave Arthur the skinny on what he had just read. No safety. Exclaimed Arthur. What sort of gun is that? I guess it's one where if you pull the trigger, you mean to pull it. Bottom line. Keep your bloody finger away from the trigger unless you intend to use it, okay? Think I'll let you hold the thing from now on? Offered Arthur. Good idea, then thought about the cash. That's a lot of cash, Arthur. You sure your old man doesn't rob banks? He asked. Yeah. I had the same thoughts. I guess we'll find out in Budapest. Maybe he's got a bank job for us there. Teased Phil. Did you see anyone suspicious? Nah, nothing. You? Nah. No one that end? Hopefully we've escaped their attention. Whoever they are. Responded Arthur, unaware of the prying eyes. But they had not escaped their attention. The Cardinal and Francis had settled into their seats a watchful distance. The Cardinal was an expert of surveillance. Astute as to others on the train that may have an interest in his assignment. There were 2 gentlemen traveling alone. Without luggage. Neither seemed to be aware of the other. The gentlemen were incongruent with their surroundings. And did not belong in the picture. They did not belong on the train. Yet there they were. The more he watched them, the more he assessed the men was following the sun. As he was speculating their origin, and quickly surmised that at least 2 relic collectors were in pursuit of the sun. How would they know about the sun? He asked himself, before questioning a possible leak at the Vatican. He would plug the leak on his return. He would watch these 2 gentlemen, and the sun. And would remedy their presence, at a suitable time. He loathed completion. The Cardinal would not be sharing the bounty. Border control. Arthur recalled the procedure they would go through at the border control. Having only been there a couple of times while on student weekends away. So long as they looked like two weary backpackers, which they were, they would pass without suspicions. The trick was to stay calm, and not to attract attention to themselves. That was easy for him. His whole life he had been invisible to people. The same could not be said of Phil. Any attempt to change his behavior would immediately draw the attention. If Phil louted about, then hopefully he would be dismissed as just another adolescent delinquent. Albeit at the age of 29. He decided to let Phil be Phil. His plan to hide the money and gun was a good one, though not original. It could well work. The Eurostar crawled on its hands and knees into coquelles and eased to a halt, hissing a release of modern steam over the tracks. Passengers stood from their seats and gathered their bags, and formed an orderly queue in the aisle to disembark, following each other like sheep towards the processing pens. Bags would be X-rayed, bodies scanned for offensive items. One suspicious individual stood out more than those about him. As though he were a fanatical extremist, pulled aside by security and questioned, only to turn out to be a Syrian returning home after visiting relatives in Britain. The Cardinal and Francis joined the queue, but were instructed to go through once their documentation had been cited. Had Phil paid more attention, he would have known the old man from the restroom incident. His mind preoccupied with a duffel bag hidden in the restroom ceiling. Looking as they should, two English backpackers. Benign. One by one the passengers were be processed and reboarded the Eurostar. Carriage doors closed again, sealing them within the metal cocoon. Then smoothly accelerated northeast towards Brussels. Resuming their seats, they talked about what would happen when they arrived. Both had differing priorities. Though Phil was keen for a beer, Arthur suggested they would not have time. Their timetable was tight if they were to make it to Vienna by that evening. Vienna? Exclaimed Phil. Yeah. We'll stay a night there and make our way to Budapest tomorrow morning. I want to catch the professor by midday, then qualified, so there'll be no time for sightseeing, pub crawls, or chasing skirt for that matter. Mate. Where's the fun in that? Said Phil despondently. There isn't any. We here to find my father, not find you a girlfriend. He added. We'll see. Trying to have the final word. Staring out the window and contemplated the unknown they were traveling towards. Their reflections staring back at them, also contemplating the unknown. On the other side of the aisle sitting unseen, Michael stared out his window. He had no reflection staring back at him. The duffel bag would remain its hiding place until they disembarked. Until they reached the professor, Arthur's main task was to keep an eye on Phil. How hard could that be? A carriage back, the Cardinal had been keeping an eye on the two nomadic men that were watching the son and his friend. Francis had adapted to his incognito and inconspicuous character. It seemed to come naturally to him. Perhaps he may not be a burden after all, the Cardinal thought. Unaware of the men the Cardinal had detected, Francis had been sent on the arduous assignment to retrieve sandwiches. Cassini could surmise that the men were relic collectors' henchmen. But whose? Braun's, Marconi's, Levi's? Were there others on the train, he wondered? He would watch the pair until they got to Brussels and would see if they reboarded. No doubt belonging to criminal underworld organizations. The Cardinal was from an organization above ground, and very much larger, involved in other assignments that required his unique skill. This would be no different. But it would be a first for the father. Care must be taken to protect his fledgling underling. Indeed, thought Michael, overhearing the Cardinal's concern for Francis. Cassini was already a few steps ahead of Arthur and Phil, and knew about the concealed duffel bag, the gun and the money. It was his job to know these things. Having seen Phil go in with a duffel bag and leave without it, it did not take much imagination to know something had been left behind. Hidden. Phil may have thought he had tidied the rest room, but Cassini's astute observation detected anomalies, and deduced their cause. Looking to the ceiling panel to unravel the puzzle, he would leave the duffel bag where it was hidden. Not wanting to arouse panic in his quarry, his task to tail them to the father, and to the ring, armed with his own weapon, was well versed in self-defense, and could handle the henchman in his own time, in his own unique way. God had dealt him a good hand. And with any hand, you never let your opponent know what you're holding. Cassini resumed his poker face, and sat quietly reading the morning paper. In just over an hour they would arrive in Brussels. Cassini watched the henchman, whom with Francis, watched Arthur and Phil, who were in turn admiring the French autumn countryside passing them by, unaware of the eyes watching them. Phil confirms the timetable from Brussels to Vienna on the laptop. There's one that leaves at 1 p.m. That's the first available. There is another an hour later, Phil added, hoping he could stall him into staying for a beer. Nice try, mate. But we're not staying any longer than we have to. I want to make it to Vienna by this evening, okay? Warned Arthur. There might be a bar at the station, he suggested. Okay. But we're staying in the station. Okay. Phil conceded. Once we clear the border control, go get the bag, okay? Okay. Relieved to have scored a beer. No sooner had the Eurostar left the British-French border, it crawled into the French-Belgium border control. An almost identical sequence of events occurred again. The two men with special papers were shuffled through with no search of their bags or bodies. The suspicious Syrian terrorist was stopped and searched and questioned once again, only to be released until the next checkpoint. Arthur and Phil went with the flock, and were soon returned to their pen. The Eurostar accelerated slowly and resumed its high-speed journey north to Brussels. The two young men stared out the window, oblivious to the innumerable souls staring back at them, oblivious to the country steeped in history, steeped in bloodshed, of a country once named Gaul, once occupied by Celts. Roman legions marched through and took control of the country in the 1st century, only to be displaced by Franks, Germanic tribes, in the 5th century. By the 9th century, Charlemagne crowned himself king, and began seeding a lineage that reigned 1,000 years. A French Revolution would lead to the massacre of Swiss guards, and a young Napoleon would dismantle Charlemagne's new Holy Roman Empire. That was neither holy nor an empire. Germanic tribes would return 2 more times, more mechanized than the first, only to be repelled by Allied forces. A carpet of blood-red poppies covered the romantic rolling countryside. Killing fields, fertilized with the blood and bones of the young men called from around the world looking for adventure, only to find an early death. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said Arthur. "Lovely," replied Phil, enchanted by the sea of blood-red flowers. "Tragic," said Michael, remembering the loss of countless lives and souls he had gathered. Looking about the cabin, and blindly seeing nothing untoward, Phil ventured to the restroom. From his cloaked seating position, the Cardinal observed Phil entering the restroom without a duffel bag, and as expected existed with one. It was obvious to the Cardinal that the henchman had not paid attention to this anomaly. Too busy watching the sun to be distracted by his friend. Amateurs, Cassini thought. "Got it. Everything's there," Phil advised, passing it to Arthur. "Well done, Phil. I guess I owe you a beer for that." As though to reward him. A smile came across Phil's face. Content they had gotten away with hiding the bag. But more likely he was going to get his precious beer. "Let's just hope for your sake there is a bar at the station." "I'm not marching all over Brussels to find you a damn beer, okay?" warned Arthur. "We'll see," responded Phil, getting in the last word. Belgium beers. Rolling through the Belgium countryside was not much different that of France. Fields covered in blood-red poppies. Fields that morphed into villages, then towns, then suburbs of the ancient city. Brussels, the capital of Belgium. Home to over 1 million souls, and as many waffles. Also home to the Brussels sprout. Very popular in the 16th century, but less so these days. As with France, the Romans' legions had come and gone. Beginning as a mere chapel being built on a small island in the middle of the River Seaman, it had grown into a center of international politics. Art Nouveau architecture, waffles, mussels, chocolates, pralines. And of course lambic-style beer. Something which Phil would soon be acquainted with. The Eurostar slowed its speed into the Brussels South station, and came to a seamless stop. Hissing a relief after the short sprint from the border. As the station name suggested, it laid south. The bilingual city centre spoke both French and Dutch. As did the signposts. Arthur were on foreign ground. Neither of them could speak Dutch, and their French was limited to a few elementary words. They had an hour before their train departed. With no time to lose, Phil pulled his backpack from the overhead locker, as Arthur threw the duffel bag casually over his shoulder. Feeling the weight of the gun and money inside. And disembarked into the tide of people on the platform. From a brochure map of the station, Arthur had a rough idea where to find the nearest bar, and he headed in the general direction. Phil had already studied the map beforehand and was several of steps ahead of him. Any suspicions of being followed were lost in the mass of people coming at them, creating an information overload. Faces became meaningless, non-threatening strangers that all looked the same. Two thugs followed the two young men discreetly behind, both unaware of each other, and unaware of the Vatican's men following them. Cassini already knew where Arthur would be heading from his informant, and had booked open tickets to Budapest. The Vatican had immense resources, and its fingers in many pies and waffles. more so in the capital of political affairs. The Cardinal's assignment was to observe and not lose track of the package. Follow the sun. Find the father. Find the ring. Cassini thought to himself. Barabbas. Son of the father? He muttered to himself upon reflection. What was that, Cardinal? Asked Francis, catching what the Cardinal had said but unsure what it meant. Nothing, father. I was just talking to myself. Best we not get separated. I'll meet you on the train if we do. You have your tickets? Cassini asked. Yes, Cardinal. On the train. Repeating his instructions. We'll keep back. You watch those two, indicating the son and his friend, I'll watch the other two. Instructed Cassini. What other two? Thinking he had missed something, looking about. The two gentlemen ahead of us. One in the fawn trench coat and tweed hat. The other with a beige jacket, directing Francis' attention to the men. We've got competition if my suspicions are correct. We can afford to lose the sun. We know their next move. But these gentlemen may require a personal introduction. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt for now. Shall we? Formulating a plan. Francis observed the two men, and gathered the impression that the men were indeed following the sun. Cassini held the upper hand for now, and always had an ace up his sleeve. Or in this case, his pocket. Arthur and Phil went with the flow of people. Looking at different eateries and cafes embedded into the station's walls. Phil's sharp eyes soon spotted what he had been going on about since leaving London. Large windows with frosted-in elaborate lettering on them. World-famous Belgian beers served. His eyes lit up with a discovery. A heavy plum-colored velvet curtain concealed the entrance, providing insulation from the autumn chill. Pushing this to one side, he enters the bar. Crowded, worked his way to the bar. Colorful badges adorned each beer handle. Crafted by monasteries, and handed down through the ages. Phil guessed the monks had nothing better to do than make home brew. Perhaps I missed my calling, he thought. Then wondered if he could really shave his head. Or take a vow of celibacy and abstinence. Perhaps not on second thoughts. He thought again. While Phil perused the tap selection, Arthur had found a table, and allow him to do what he did best. Buy the beers. Having had narrowed his choice down to Lefbrun for Arthur. And a blonde? He always preferred blondes. Carrying two large bulbous glasses over to Arthur's table. Here you go, mate. He exclaimed, placing two very frothy beers on the table. Cheers, mate. Arthur raises the glass towards Phil. Here's to a great adventure, mate. Thanks for coming. Toasted Arthur. No worries, mate. You know I wouldn't let you go by yourself. Phil reminded him. I'm glad I told you about the letter. Conceding it was now a good idea, taking a savory mouthful of beer. The beer tasted sweeter with each successive sips. Arthur pondered the situation in which they found themselves. Barely 2 hours into their journey, and they had made as far as a Belgian bar drinking beer. A great start to hazardous adventure across Europe. A long way from Watford. A long way from the safety of his father's armchair. A long way from his prying aunt, but nonetheless looked about the bar in case she had followed them. Where was going and what would he do when he got there? He had no idea. The journey was a blank canvas being painted by the moment. Each hour another brush stroke. The answers to his father's brief letter waited for him in Budapest. With Professor Olmisch. They had an hour to unwind and enjoy a couple beers before they had to get back to the train. Sitting on a tall stool, a short squat man in a fawn trench coat sipped on a weak beer. Reading the Guardian newspaper he had brought from London. Sitting not too far away from him was another gentleman, a glass of red wine at hand. Eyes were fixed on the sun. Cassini stood at the bar with his back to the two gentlemen, sipping on short glass of whiskey neat, while Francis supped on a pale beer. The mirror on the wall in front of them would provide ample observation for now. Chatter and music filled the bar, dousing nearby conversations. Feeling lightheaded after their second beer, Arthur decided it was time to head back to the train, as did several other passengers that were taking the same train. As Phil was turning to leave, noticed a man at the bar looking at him in the mirror's reflection. Their eyes made brief contact. Not for the first time, he recalled vaguely, and a fleeting tinge of déjà vu came over him. His recollections dampened by the beer, his mind stained by the alcohol, busy trying to place the face. Where had he seen him before? Dismissing the connection, followed Arthur out the doors. Cassini did not entirely dismiss the connection. It had been brief, but held. What mattered was that he was following them, and not the other way around. The short squat man in the fawn trench coat soon followed the young men some distance behind. A moment later the beige-jacketed man joined the line of people making their way back to the train. Cassini finished his drink. There was no rush. He knew where to find the sun, and would keep the other two men under observation until an opportune time to assist them off the train. Finding their seats again, stowed their packs in the overhead lockers, and made themselves comfortable for the 11-hour 1,100-kilometer journey to Vienna. Briefly stopping at Frankfurt, Nuremberg and Munich to pick up additional passengers. Arriving just before midnight. Budapest would be the end of the line. No more trains. Never again. Flying is the only way, thought Arthur. That was the plan. But plans have a habit of changing. Alistair McGee. To say Istanbul is a massive is an understatement. Resident to 14 million religiously tolerant souls, it constituted the largest city in Europe. In a transcontinental country that had one foot in the Balkan and a much larger foot in East Asia, separated by a strait stitched together by bridges, bordering 8 countries and 3 seas. Its claws dipped into the Black, Aegean and Mediterranean seas. Turkey had seen the rise and fall of mighty empires. Alexander the Great, Romans, Byzantines, Ottomans, all came and went, all falling to the next mighty empire and the sands of time. And with great power came great abuse, massacres and genocides. The beginning of the Silk Road began here and stretched as far east as Korea and Japan. Crusaders trudged through the country on their way to Jerusalem. Ottomans chose the wrong side during the Great War and paid the price with dissolution. Their empire no more. While Arthur and Phil enjoyed ginger cake and tea with his aunt earlier that morning, Arthur's father had arranged to meet a colleague of a colleague at an obscure cafe opposite a not-so-obscure marketplace. The Grand Bazaar, with over 4,000 stores on 61 covered streets, high walls punctuated with 22 ancient gateways, catering to over 250,000 daily visitors, trading wares from every corner of the world, as it had done so for the past 5 centuries, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Alistair could hear the perpetual drone of the market, as if it were a hive of bees making money. High-rise buildings supplanted tents, electricity and automobiles supplanted camels. Dusty, flea-bitten citizens were brought kicking and screaming and itching into the 20th century. Much like Cardinal Doversey, Turkey was indifferent as to whether it really wanted to catch up. Looking at the bazaar today, it would be difficult to ascertain the century one was in. An astute time traveler would spot an out-of-place Rolex, a smartphone. Alistair casually reclined in a rattan chair. One would have taken him for a local enjoying an agile smoke, taking shallow puffs on the pipe, not looking out of place with the surroundings. His placid appearance, brought on by the fragrant smoke, and attuned to the pulse of the marketplace, he blended in as if he was one of them, for which he was not. 11:50 a.m. 2 small coffee cups sat waiting on the small table, waiting to be consumed. Waiting on a visitor. A colleague of Professor Ormish. Though they had never met before, he would recognize him when, and if he arrived. They were to meet before the day became unbearable with the harsh afternoon sun. Turquoise shell sunglasses resting on the bridge of his nose. Beads of sweat were forming under his fedora hat, could not disguise his English intolerance to the East Asian heat. Taking another puff, insouciantly scanned the marketplace for people out of place. People looking at him. People standing about doing nothing. For no reason. People wearing sunglasses. Not wishing to be identified. Reaching to a jacket pocket, feels the reassuring cool steel of a snub-nose 38 Special. Very effective at a short distance. And very, very loud. Guaranteed to disperse a crowd, or anyone standing in front it. It had served him well, persuading people to part with treasured relics. Glancing over the newspaper, spies a suspicious character on a mobile on the other side of the street. Looking his way. Then glancing away as their eyes met. Questioned his thoughts. Assessing the man's clothing. He was dressed too neat. Too sharp to be a local. Someone on an affordable salary. Few people around here could afford his clothes. Without a camera, he was not a tourist. Lowering eyes, pretended to look elsewhere. Then glanced back again. The man was still on the mobile talking to someone. Their eyes met again and momentarily locked. Then disengaged. Now he was certain he was being watched. Were there others? Glancing to his left. Then casually to his right. If there were, he could not see them. Others would be waiting in the shadows. Watching. Reporting back to their masters. Word must have gotten out about the ring, he thought. Dismissing his predicament, he had been in tighter spots than this. This was Istanbul. Sometimes the law did not apply. The police were as much of a problem as a solution. assessing the situation and how it could play out. They would not move on him until they knew he had the ring. Obviously they did not know about the colleague, or they would not be watching him. At that moment he thought of Arthur, hoping he was on his way to Budapest. Unsure how he would have explained it to his aunt. Checking his watch, saw there was still another 5 minutes before the colleague was expected to arrive. Assuming he could find the cafe. There were hundreds cafes, one on every corner, and all looking the same. The man on the other side of the street reached inside his jacket, thinking was reaching for a gun, only to pull out a pack of cigarettes. Lighting one, continued to talk on the mobile. A series of small nods suggested he was getting instructions. The call ended, and pocketed the phone. Taking a long draw on the cigarette, glanced briefly to look at Alistair. Then turned and disappeared into the moving crowd of people on the pavement. He'll be back, Alistair thought. The prize was too formidable to let go so easily. Reaching to his pocket to touch the reassuring metal of gun again. And waited. Where was the colleague, he wondered. He would allow him a window of time to arrive before making his next move. Nothing ever ran to perfectly schedule in his business. Improvisation and adaptation were the keys to survival. Experience had taught him to be patient. Fear and hasty decisions would undo the best of plans. Stay relaxed. Stay calm. And carry on, he told to himself. 12:10 a.m. and a grubby yellow taxi pulled up outside the cafe. Looking phased and lost, an elderly gentleman appears from the cab, paying the driver several lira above the fare before it drove off along the dusty street. A straw hat covered the gentleman's balding head of thinning grey hair. Wearing a lightly soiled cotton suit, stained with dust, attracted to it, and looking more like a lost professor than a tourist. A camera suspended around his neck, as instructed by Alistair earlier that morning, adding little to the impromptu disguise. The professor looked about the cafe, and confirmed the tattered sign as the place. Peering through the haze of smoke, the professor made eye contact with Alistair. He was about to raise his hand to acknowledge his arrival, when Alistair shook his head discreetly in time for the professor to withdraw the gesture, and made his way around the wicker chairs of hallucinated smokers. "Please have a seat, Professor. Thank you for coming," said Alistair quietly, and the two men discreetly shook hands, keeping his conversation to a minimum from prying ears. Alistair's hands fell to his lap, and fingers fidgeted beneath the table. Ears and eyes were everywhere in Turkey. Morals were in short supply here, and easily sold to the highest bidder. "I was a little worried I would never find the place," responded the professor anxiously. "I am sure the taxi driver took me the long way here," he added. "It wouldn't be fair if he hadn't," he added to calm the professor. With the professor's back to the street, Alistair scanned the horizon from the cafe, inhaling deeply on the smoke, and nodded a small nods of approval, as though in discussion with an old friend. Their business had been concluded the moment they had shaken hands. The exchange had been seamless and undetected by the prying eyes. A magician would have been proud of them. Having secured the ring on a finger, and turned it face down to conceal the relief on the crown, as far as anyone could tell he was wearing a simple dull silver ring. But it was far from being a dull silver ring. It was an ancient holy relic belonging to the guardian of the keys to heaven, the first bishop of Rome, Saint Peter. The relic was now residing on Alistair's wedding finger. This was not the time or place to examine it. His assignment was simple. Collect the ring and deliver it. Stick to the plan, he minded himself. Would you like a coffee while you're here? He asked, pushing one of the two small cups towards the professor. Thank you. Taking a sip from the now cold coffee, refreshing in the heat of the midday sun. After talk of the weather and current affairs, it was time for the professor to leave and be lost again in the fog of the multitudes. Waving down a passing taxi that was circling, ushered the professor into the back, directing the driver to take the passenger back to his hotel, handing him enough money for a round trip, instructing him not to stop for no one. The driver nodded as if to appease Alistair. This was Turkey, life was cheap, and money talked. The taxi slipped into the traffic orbiting the bazaar, to be consumed by the other traffic around it. Alistair returned to his seat to finish his coffee and ponder his next move. Thoughts shifted to Arthur again. Perhaps he would call the Professor Ormish later to check on him. Lifting the newspaper, scanned its horizon and the street opposite. The cigarette man had returned, and he had a friend with him. They had seen the meeting. But how much had they really seen, he wondered. Inhaling deeply on the pipe one last time, exhaled a large plume of smoke into air. The predicament did not faze him. He had a friend in his pocket, and his friend was very noisy when it needed to be. Standing casually, leaves a moderate tip for the attractive Turkish waitress, and walked to the curb as if nothing was untoward. Waiting for a gap in the traffic, made his way through the slow-moving derelict vehicles, and walked towards the two men, a hand resting in his pocket. Confused, they stood stunned, unsure what to make of it. Was he about to attack them? At the last moment he turned and headed into a gate of the bazaar. He knew the market well enough from previous visits. The warren of streets within provided cover to evade anyone following. If the two men following wanted to make a scene, Alistair was prepared to give them an audience. The bazaar was alive. A giant pulsing heart beating 24/7. The size several large office blocks. Through its arteries, veins and capillaries, flowed human corpuscles. Money talked in the bazaar, defying rules of modern finance. It answered to no one but itself. Disagreements would be settled within its walls. Alistair had one that needed settling. Colorful mosaics decorated high-arched ceilings. Walls dripped with merchandise of every kind imaginable. Boulevards smelt of the aromatic herbs, pungent spices and the seasoned dishes. Corpuscles circulated in all directions, before being spat onto the sun-drenched dusty streets. Leached of their lira, laden with their replica Aladdin lanterns and Persian tapestries. Losing the men would be difficult. Gauging his bearings, quickened the pace and made his way deeper into the bazaar, hoping the men would follow him. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Cracking eggs. It's time to crack some eggs, Alistair told himself, and set about to divide and conquer. Stopping at one of a carpet store, casually examined a rug, discreetly eyeing the two men that lingered some distance behind. their garb making it difficult for them to blend in. Appearing in no rush to jump him in the crowded street, he continued on his way. Walking past stalls, then abruptly turned into a narrow alley. Dark and dusty, the air marked with the stench of urine. Halfway down, there was a doorway set into the wall, and he quickly stood in it, hoping the men had not seen, closing eyes to become accustomed to the dark. The pungent air made it difficult to think as he anticipated their next move, and waited, hoping the men would split up. One go around the other side to cut him off, and that one would come down the alley. Reluctant to use the 38. It would be too loud in the confined space, and attract attention. If both men ventured down the alleyway, then he would be in trouble. Then he would have called upon his friend in his pocket to assist. He waited, taking shallow breaths. Feels his heart thumping in his chest, making out soft footsteps approaching. One man, he thought. No voices. A good sign, but no guarantee. Pressing himself deeper into the shadowy corner, a darkness appeared on the ground approaching the doorway. The man hesitated before the doorway, as Alistair had anticipated, and raised the barrel of his gun. Without thinking, Alistair rushes the at hand holding the gun. A shot goes off. The bullet plugs into the dirt floor. The percussion was lost in the drone of the bazaar, twisting the man's hand upwards and to the side. Breaks the man's hold of the gun, and it falls to the ground. Striking the man with an elbow, connects with his jaw, briefing disorienting him. The man lashes out with a wild series of punches, catching Alistair's ribs, temporarily winding him and recoiling him backwards. Rushing forward, Alistair sends his knee into the man's loins, and buckling him over, delivers a heavy blow to the back of the neck. A distinct crack was heard, and the man falls unconscious to the ground. Unsure if the man was dead or alive, dragged his body into the doorway. With no time to stand about, he had to get out of there before the other man arrived. Pocketing the gun, continued down the alley, and went in search of his prey, leaving his friend sleeping in the doorway behind him. If anyone had seen the incident, they were not sticking around to file any paperwork. There was an unwritten law: what happens in the bazaar stayed in the bazaar, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries to come. Wanting to lure the second man, as he had the first, and it was not hard to spot him standing on a corner with a cigarette in hand, his loud-colored shirt a siren attention. Unwilling to lure him down the same alley as his sleeping friend. There were other sordid alleys that would serve the purpose. Taking a deep breath, turns his back on the man, knowing he would follow without concern for his fallen comrade. People strolled aimlessly between stalls, haggling prices, pushing his way through the crowd. The first man had been relatively easy to dispense with. The second may not be as easy, as he headed down another dark alleyway. The familiar smell filled his nostrils. There was no doorway down this alleyway, and it was a dead end. Of all the alleyways, he had chosen this one. He was trapped. Shit. He cussed himself. Trailing some distance behind, Alistair could see the man's silhouette in the light of the street behind him. The man reached into his pocket, and pulled out a stick, flicking it expertly into a flick-blade knife. No noise to attract attention of others. Alistair had brought a gun to a knife fight, which seemed a little unfair. But then knife fights never are. Hastily removing his jacket, wrapped it around his arm as a shield. He would have to be swift to avoid the man's blade. The width of the alleyway would limit each other's movements, as would the darkness their vision. The man grinned with pleasure, having cornered him, lunging at him with the blade only to be deflected and slapped abruptly across the ear by a brutal palm. Like an agitated bull, the man snorted and growled at the frustration of missing its target. Like a matador, Alistair turned around only to have the assailant lung at him again. The blade caught the coat and arm, cutting it a wound that bled through his coat, flinching as the blade etched its mark. Enraged, the bull had tasted blood and came quickly at Alistair again, raising his arm as a shield, knowing he would take the damning wound. Grimaced with pain as the knife embedded itself in his forearm, momentarily disorienting the agitated bull and allowing Alistair to throw a massive fist into the bull's nose, breaking it with a cracking sound, causing it to bleed worse than him. Off balance, the man stuttered backwards, wrenching the blade free from the impaled arm. Spitting blood, the raging bull came at him again, sweeping wild blows with a sharp metal horn, hoping to make contact. Alistair's defensive left arm went up again, and pain resonated as his fist swung in full fury, connecting with the man's jaw and sending it sideways. Stumbling backwards, the man falls backwards onto an exposed metal spike protrusion from the wall. Penetrating his back, it exits his chest. Gasping for breath, looking down at the protruding fatal bloody wound, then looked up bewildered by the brilliant white light, and to Alistair, as if someone was standing beside him. Arms fall flaccid to his side, the metal horn still frozen in the man's grip. Only he and Michael saw the divine light. Eyes rolled upwards. Darkness again filled the earthly realm, and the pungent bitter-sweet smell of urine returned to Alistair's nostrils. His heart beating fast, an arm throbbing with pain. The cold sensation of blood trickled down over his hand and fingers. Looking to the street for curious observers. None. Just passers-by. Anyone who did look would only have seen a darkened alley, with no time to lose. Others would be in pursuit, and he was not about to stick around to find out. Leaving the sodder where he had fallen, it could days before anyone would discover the man, and Alistair would be long gone. The knife in the man's hand, the only clue as to the events that led to his demise. His arm needed attention, and he knew a doctor that would not ask too many questions for the right money. Wrapping a handkerchief as a dressing around the bloody wound, draped his jacket over his arm, bloody side down, composed himself and strolled onto the street as if he had just relieved himself, which in some way he just had, and fused with those exiting the bazaar. Waving down the first taxi he saw, fell low into the back seat, sweat building under his fedora, ordering the driver to take him to Taksim without stopping for anyone. A rabid warren of dusty, uneven alleys some 5 kilometers to the south, rife with unemployed, crime and prostitution. It would be the last place anyone would look, or would wish to visit. Looking about for anyone was following. If there were, he could not see them. The driver's eyes peered at the rear vision mirror, He would be rewarded handsomely for this ride, he thought. And for any information about this mysterious Englishman. The pain in his left forearm beginning to pronounce its presence. He examined the ring around his finger, now baptized with his blood. Frankfurt. Some hours after Alistair had fallen into the back seat of the taxi, the Eurostar left Brussels, traveling towards its next stop, Frankfurt. The two young men had fallen under the influence of the beers, and began to snooze. If Arthur had thought he had been dealt a rough hand, he need only look out the window to the historic Deutschland rolling past his window to feel better about himself. Humans first arrived there 500,000 years before the Eurostar, followed by the soon-to-be extinct Neanderthals. Unable to tame the people east of the Rhine, Julius Caesar would call the land, and its barbarian people, Germania. With the fall of the Roman Empire, the Germanic tribes amalgamated to form the foundation of what became France and Germany. The Frankish king Charlemagne resurrected the Roman Empire, and called it holy. Martin Luther would challenge the Catholic Church, with his 95 Theses, and ignite a powder keg of the Protestant Reformation debate. That would continue for another 100 years, followed by another 30 years of war. What man could not kill, the Black Plague would provide assistance. Erupting like a rash of smallpox, over 1,800 principalities, palaces, and summer houses speckled the empire, before Napoleon systematically dismantled it. The Archduke of Austria would be shot by a Yugoslav nationalist, resulting in paperwork being completed before war could be declared, and young men could be called up to die needlessly in a war that would capitulate into a truce. The League of Nations would tally the cost, and present Germany with a bill. But not before by partitioning its territories amongst themselves, and light the fuse for the next great war. The Eurostar's regimented carriages rolled softly over the German countryside so as not to disturb the bones of the dead that lay beneath. Germanic tribesmen, Roman legionnaires, French infantry. Young men from foreign lands who gave their lives for king and country. Two young men sat sleeping in a carriage riding above, unaware of the horrific historical events that had taken place beneath them. They awoke to find the train arriving into Munich. Phil suggested it would be a good time to stretch their legs and check out the local bars. Arthur agreed reluctantly. Having spent the past 6 hours sitting down, it seemed a good opportunity to get the circulation moving again. Leaving their packs on board, Arthur grabbed the duffel bag, feeling the awkward and uncomfortable weight of the gun and money inside, and went in search of the nearest bar, unaware of their unseen surveillance. The beige coat man followed, while the short squat man decided to stay on board and watch from his window. Cassini instructed Francis to stay on board to keep an eye on him. He would follow the beige coat man at a distance. Germany, ranked third in the world for beer consumption per capita, it was not hard for Phil to find a bar. Spotting the first tavern, he left Arthur in his wake. Slipping through open doors, headed straight to the bar, and is greeted by a beautiful buxom blonde behind the counter. Distracted momentarily by the Fräulein's buxom bosoms erupting from her low-cut top, for the first time in his life lost for words. "2 lagers, thanks, love," said Arthur, coming to the rescue. "Thanks, mate. I got distracted," stammered Phil in embarrassment. "Yeah, I could see that, unlike you." He winked at the barmaid, smiling back. "I will bringen dies over to you. Dank mein Herr." instructed the barmaid, suggesting they should take a seat. "Come on, Phil. Let's grab a table by the window. We'll have a couple here and get dinner on the train. Figure we can get a taxi to the nearest hotel when we arrive in Vienna. How's that sound?" "Good plan, Arthur. Here comes the beers. I'm starting like this adventure you have me on." "1. I don't have you on it. You invited yourself," corrected Arthur. "Good call. Have to concede that one, Artie. Pleading guilty to the charge. And 2. This is not pub crawl." "Okay. We'll see about that," said Phil, lifting the large stein of golden beer with a large frothy head. "Cheers, mate. These are quite large, aren't they?" "Maybe we'll stick to 1," warned Arthur. "We'll see how this one goes down first," qualified Phil. Braun's man ordered a large dark stein of ale, drinking it as if it was water, and ordering another. Cassini watched on from a distant corner, sipping quietly on a coffee. His mind would need to clear should he need to engage the man. Every now and again glancing up to ensure the sun was in sight. Francis had remained on the train, and read his paperback. Every now and again glancing up to observe the short squat man reading The Guardian. It was a game of cat and mouse. But who was the cat and who was the mouse? After the first stein, Phil headed to the gents to relieve himself. Moments later the beige coat rose to his feet and followed. Not unnoticed by the Cassini. He would keep a watchful eye on Arthur. On entering the restroom, Phil took a position at the urinals. Giggling equipment in time with the overhead music. The beer had made him feel light-headed. Still he sensed there was someone watching him. A proximity that made him uncomfortable. Braun's man stood 2 urinals over, flaccidly going through the motions fruitlessly. Phil headed to the basins, splashing water on his face to awaken his dulled senses. Looking up, he saw the man's reflection in the mirror standing behind him. A hand reaching inside his jacket for something. With no time to think, Phil turned around and did what he did best. Throwing a massive fist into the man's face and sending him onto the floor. And the gun that he was reaching for sliding across the tiled floor, taking him by surprise at the sight of it. The man scrambles to reach for the gun only to be kicked in the ribs. "Oh no, you don't, you bastard," warned Phil, quickly realizing how close he had come to being shot. Standing to his feet, the man stood over him. But Phil had toppled taller trees. "Bring it on," Phil encouraged eagerly, keen for a fight. Stepping forward, the man swung wildly at him, connecting with one with little effect. Phil returned the punches, knocking the wind from the man, who fell to his knees. With a final upper up, connects with the man's jaw, sending him backwards into urinals. After slamming the man's head against the porcelain, drags the man to one of the cubicles, shoving his head down a toilet, and flushed it. Wanting so much to drown the man who had tried to pull a gun in him. Hearing someone entering the restroom, drops the man to the floor. Thinking an accomplice had followed him in, he peered from the cubicle to see who had walked in. Just an old man. One of the passengers. Dismissing any recollections of earlier, closes the cubicle door, and returned to the hand basin. Splashing water again over his face. Looking up to see the old man still at the urinal. He heads back to inform Arthur of the encounter. Cassini notices the gun laying against the far wall. Pocketing it, surmised the events that had just taken place. Spying a faint trail of blood leading to a toilet cubicle, he followed it, only to find the beige-coat man lay in a semi-conscious state, and worse for wear. "I'm impressed. That young man can handle himself," thought the Cassini. Closing the cubicle door behind him, Cassini knelt beside the man, and removed his biretta, and secured a silencer, tapping barrel against the man's forehead, as he spoke. "Who do you work for?" Cassini asked politely with a fake grin. But the man remained silent, panting, struggling for breath after the beating, and attempted drowning. "Who do you work for? Last chance?" he asked politely, again placing the barrel against the man's leg. But the man remained defiantly silent. "I commend your loyalty. Perhaps this will help you remember." Thud. Firing a muffled shot into the thigh. The man screamed loudly. "Sure," soothed Cassini, tapping the heated barrel on his forehead. "Now, as I was saying, who is your boss?" "Last chance," Cassini, pressing the barrel into the man's groin, raising an eyebrow and tilting his head, as if to say, "Well then, Braun." "Ah," came the struggled reply, breath ragged and panting, fighting back the pain in his leg. "I should have known," responded Cassini, not surprised by the name. Their paths had crossed in the past, and no doubt would again in the future. "Tell Mr. Braun that the Cardinal says to keep away. The boy is mine. Understand me?" The man nodded anxiously, knowing his life had been spared.